The air in the Kang family's private conference room was thick with silence. The late chairman Kang Ji-ho's portrait loomed over the long mahogany table, his sharp gaze frozen in time. The golden lettering beneath his image read, "The price of fortune is responsibility." Sitting stiffly in a leather chair, Kang Ji-ho exhaled sharply. Dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that fit his lean, well-built frame to perfection, he looked every bit the heir of a corporate empire. His presence exuded control. His jet-black hair slicked back, his piercing dark eyes void of warmth. Beside him, the family lawyer, Seo Min-kyu, cleared his throat and adjusted his silver-rimmed glasses before beginning the will's final clause. "Mr. Kang Ji-ho, in order to inherit your grandfather's entire estate, including the controlling shares of Kang Group, you must marry the woman chosen by him. If you refuse, the entire fortune will be transferred elsewhere." A sharp chuckle escaped Ji-ho's lips. He leaned back, arms crossed. "Is this a joke?" His voice was smooth, controlled, yet laced with disbelief. Min-kyu remained composed. Chairman Kang was quite serious. Ji-ho narrowed his eyes. "And who exactly is this chosen woman?" Min-kyu slid a folder across the table. Ji-ho hesitated before flipping it open. A single photograph lay inside, an image of a woman standing in front of a canvas, brush in hand, eyes focused. Her name, Yoon Ha-eun. Ji-ho scoffed. "A painter?" Min-kyu adjusted his glasses again, unfazed. "She was specifically named in the contract. If you refuse to marry her, you forfeit everything." Ji-ho's fingers drummed against the table, a storm brewing in his gaze. His entire life had been spent proving himself worthy of the Kang legacy. Now, with his grandfather gone, he expected to take full control of what was rightfully his. But this was madness. The ride back to his penthouse was a blur. As Ji-ho stepped into the dimly lit living room, the cityscape of Seoul stretched before him through floor-to-ceiling windows, its endless lights twinkling like distant stars. The weight of the will pressed down on him, his grandfather's words echoing in his mind. Why this woman? His grandfather had been a man of ruthless logic. He would never make a decision based on sentimentality. There had to be a reason. Ji-ho poured himself a glass of whiskey, the ice clinking softly. He sat on the leather couch, opening the folder once more. Ha-eun's face stared back at him. She had delicate features, the kind that lingered in the mind. Large, expressive eyes that seemed to hold a story within them, lips slightly parted as if she had just whispered a secret. There was something unsettling about her presence in this contract. "Who are you, Yoon Ha-eun? And more importantly, why did my grandfather choose you?" The next morning, Ji-ho stepped out of his car onto the cobbled streets of Bukchon Hanok village, a stark contrast to the towering steel and glass of his usual surroundings. The traditional Hanok houses, with their curved rooftops and wooden frames, exuded an old-world charm. The scent of pine and ink drifted in the cool spring air, mixing with the distant hum of a gaya-geum being played by a street performer. He approached a modest art gallery, its name Eternal Dream, painted in soft brush strokes on a wooden sign. Through the open doors, the scent of oil paint and fresh canvas filled the air. And then he saw her. Yoon Ha-eun stood in the center of the gallery, absorbed in her work. A brush poised between her slender fingers. She moved with an effortless grace, her long raven hair cascading over one shoulder. The light from the skylight bathed her in a soft glow, making her appear almost ethereal. For a brief second, Ji-ho hesitated. She turned, sensing his presence, her dark eyes locking onto his. And just like that, the battle had begun. The silence stretched between them, heavy and unyielding. Yoon Ha-eun studied the man before her, taking in the sharp lines of his face, the unwavering intensity in his dark eyes. He didn't belong here. Everything about him, his sleek, tailored suit, the air of power he carried, clashed with the warmth of the Eternal Dream Gallery. where colors danced on canvases and soft music drifted in the air. Ji-ho, however, remained unfazed. He had spent years perfecting the art of controlling a room, of making his presence impossible to ignore. But Ha-eun... She didn't flinch under his gaze. A flicker of something unreadable passed through her expression before she carefully set down her brush. "You're blocking the light," she said, her voice even, but firm. Ji-ho arched a brow. He hadn't expected that. People usually adjusted to him, not the other way around. Slowly, he stepped to the side, but his eyes never left her. "Yoon Ha-eun?" She wiped her hands on a cloth, a hint of paint staining her fingers. "Who's asking?" "The man whose name was forced onto a marriage contract with yours." His words were smooth, deliberate, but there was an underlying sharpness to them. He watched for a reaction, expecting surprise, maybe even confusion. Instead, she let out a soft breath, more exasperation than shock. "So you finally showed up." That caught him off guard. Her tone wasn't that of someone caught unaware. It was as if she had been expecting him, and that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Ji-ho narrowed his eyes slightly, observing her. "You knew?" Ha-eun crossed her arms, shifting her weight onto one foot. "A lawyer came by a few days ago, left a copy of the contract." She tilted her head, studying him in return. "I thought you'd send someone instead of coming yourself." There it was again, that quiet, unwavering confidence. Ji-ho wasn't sure if it irritated him or intrigued him. "Trust me, I had no intention of coming," he admitted, voice edged with amusement. "But I needed to see for myself." She let out a small laugh, though there was no humor in it. "And, am I what you expected?" Ji-ho took a moment, eyes scanning the gallery around them. The space was modest but full of life. Vibrant paintings lined the walls, and the scent of turpentine and fresh flowers mingled in the air. The place reflected her, unpretentious, warm, yet carrying a quiet depth. "No," he answered honestly. Ha-eun didn't seem surprised. If anything, a ghost of a smile tugged at her lips. "Good. I'd hate to be predictable." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, the faint sound of chattering tourists and rustling cherry blossom trees drifted through the open window. Inside, the tension hummed like a low note in the air, not hostile, but charged with something neither of them could name yet. Ji-ho exhaled sharply. "Let's not waste time. I assume you're rejecting the contract as well?" Ha-eun hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. It was so quick that most people wouldn't have noticed, but Ji-ho did. "Of course," she said, but there was something guarded in her voice now. Ji-ho leaned in slightly, just enough to watch her reaction. "You don't sound convinced." Ha-eun held his gaze, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something she was trying to bury. Ji-ho had spent years in boardrooms reading people, deciphering the unspoken, and right now, Yoon Ha-eun was hiding something. The realization sent an unexpected thrill through him. "Why did my grandfather choose you?" His voice was quieter now, measured, as if testing the weight of his own question. Ha-eun's fingers curled slightly at her sides, and for the first time, she looked away. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I intend to find out." That wasn't the answer he expected. Ji-ho straightened, slipping his hands into his pockets. "Then it seems we have something in common." Ha-eun glanced back at him, eyes narrowing slightly. "And what's that?" A slow smirk played at the corner of Ji-ho's lips. "Neither of us likes being manipulated." Ha-eun didn't respond right away. Instead, she studied him again, as if trying to see past the polished exterior, past the arrogance, past the walls he had built. Whatever she saw made her exhale softly, as if accepting an unspoken challenge. "Then I suppose this isn't over," she murmured. Ji-ho's smirk deepened. No, it's just getting started. The tension lingered between them as the weight of their words settled. Outside, the cherry blossoms swayed gently in the breeze, a quiet witness to a story that had only just begun. Ji-ho adjusted the cuffs of his suit, his sharp gaze never leaving Ha-eun's face. The air between them was charged, not quite hostile, but brimming with an unspoken challenge. "You're serious about this?" he asked, his voice measured. Ha-eun tilted her head slightly, studying him as if deciding how much to reveal. "I already told you. I want answers." Ji-ho let out a quiet scoff, stepping back just enough to put distance between them. He was used to negotiations, to people wanting something from him. But this woman, she wasn't trying to impress him, nor was she trying to intimidate him. She was just standing her ground. "Let me make this simple," he said, slipping his hands into his pockets. "I don't believe in fate. I don't believe in fairy tales. And I certainly don't believe that some dying man's last wish should dictate my life." Ha-eun's lips pressed together. "So that's what he was to you? Just a dying man?" Ji-ho's jaw tightened, but his expression remained unreadable. "That's not the point." "No," she said softly. "I think it is." A beat of silence passed. Something flickered in Ji-ho's eyes, but it was gone before she could place it. He exhaled sharply and turned toward the entrance. This was a waste of time. He started toward the door, but Ha-eun's voice stopped him. "You don't know, do you?" Ji-ho stilled. She took a step closer, and for the first time, her expression wasn't just curious, it was knowing. "You're here demanding answers from me, but you have none of your own." Her voice was quiet, but it carried weight. "You don't know why he chose me. You don't even know why you're really here." Ji-ho turned back, his stare sharp, but Ha-eun didn't flinch. "Whatever you think of me, Kang Ji-ho," she continued, "you and I are in the same position." She glanced down at the file he still held in his grip, then back at him. Both of us were left in the dark. A breeze drifted through the gallery's open windows, stirring the faint scent of oil paint and wood. Outside, laughter and conversation filled the streets of Bukchon, but inside, everything had narrowed down to just them. Ji-ho studied her, searching for any sign of deception, but all he found was sincerity. For the first time since stepping into this place, he wasn't entirely sure what his next move should be. His instincts told him to walk away. But something about Yoon Ha-eun, the quiet confidence, the way she saw through him so effortlessly, made him pause. He hated that. Finally, he exhaled through his nose, his grip tightening around the folder. "Fine," he said, voice low. "If you want answers so badly, then don't waste my time." Ha-eun's brows furrowed slightly. "What are you—" Ji-ho stepped forward, closing the space between them once more. "You have questions," he said, his tone almost challenging. "So do I." He met her gaze with quiet intensity. "Let's find them together." A flicker of something crossed Ha-eun's face. Hesitation, maybe curiosity, but she didn't look away. This time, she was the one left unsure of what came next. And Ji-ho couldn't help but feel the slightest bit victorious. The ride back to Ji-ho's office was quiet, but his mind was anything but. He sat in the back seat of his sleek black sedan, one hand resting against his temple as he replayed the conversation with Ha-eun. She was supposed to be irrelevant, just another obstacle in his path. But there was something about her that unsettled him, something that made him hesitate. Ji-ho hated hesitating. A sharp chime interrupted his thoughts. He glanced at his phone. Seo Min-kyu. "What?" Ji-ho answered, his voice clipped. "I assume you've met Miss Yoon?" Ji-ho exhaled sharply. "If you already knew, why are you asking?" A pause. Then, Min-kyu's voice, calm as always. Because I need to know what you plan to do. Ji-ho's grip tightened around the phone. He wanted to say nothing. He wanted to forget this ridiculous contract, walk away and never see Yoon Ha-eun again. But the moment he thought about her expression, the quiet defiance in her eyes, the way she had turned his own words against him, he knew he wouldn't. Ji-ho ran a hand down his face. I'll handle it. Min-kyu didn't sound surprised. Then I'll schedule a meeting. Ji-ho ended the call without replying. 2 days later, Ha-eun's studio. The scent of wet paint filled the air, mixing with the soft, earthy aroma of drying clay. Sunlight streamed through the wide windows of Ha-eun's small studio, casting golden patterns on the wooden floor. She sat on a stool, carefully adding the final strokes to her latest painting. Deep, swirling blues against stark white, like waves crashing against the shore. She barely looked up when the door opened. We're closed. Ji-ho's voice cut through the air like a blade. I don't care. Ha-eun's brush faltered for a fraction of a second. She sighed, setting it aside before turning to face him. He stood just inside the doorway, his presence too sharp, too imposing for a place like this. I should have known you wouldn't let this go, she muttered. Ji-ho didn't respond right away. Instead, his eyes flicked to the painting behind her. He had never paid much attention to art, but there was something about this piece. Something chaotic, yet deliberate. Like her. Finally, he met her gaze. Marry me. The words fell into the silence like a stone into still water. Ha-eun blinked once, then let out a sharp laugh. Excuse me? Ji-ho remained expressionless. You want answers. I want my inheritance. A 1-year contract. Then we go our separate ways. Ha-eun shook her head, almost amused. You make it sound like a business merger. That's exactly what it is. She exhaled, pressing her fingers to her temple. You can't be serious. Ji-ho stepped closer, his voice lowering just slightly. You think I want this? His tone was calm, but there was an edge beneath it. You think I want to be forced into something because of a man who's not even here anymore? Ha-eun met his gaze, searching for something in his expression. He looked composed, calculated, like always. But there was something else too. Frustration, maybe, or resentment. A part of her wanted to tell him no, to walk away and let him deal with his family's mess on his own. But another part of her, the part that had spent sleepless nights wondering why her name had been written into that will, couldn't let it go. She needed to know. And Ji-ho was her only way to find out. Ha-eun exhaled slowly, crossing her arms. 1 year. No expectations. Ji-ho inclined his head. No emotions. Something in her chest tightened at his words, but she ignored it. She extended her hand. Deal. Ji-ho looked at her for a long moment before clasping her fingers in his. His grip was firm, steady, cold. Ha-eun told herself she didn't care. But for some reason, as their hands lingered for just a second too long, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just made a mistake. The first thing Ha-eun noticed about Ji-ho's world was the silence. Not the comfortable kind, like the one she felt when painting alone in her studio, but an emptiness, cold and hollow, stretching through every corner of his towering penthouse. The day she moved in, she expected some kind of resistance, maybe even another argument. Instead, Ji-ho barely acknowledged her presence. He stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, one hand in his pocket, his back turned to her as the city lights of Seoul sprawled beneath them. This isn't a home, she murmured, setting down her small suitcase. Ji-ho didn't look at her. It's not meant to be. She exhaled through her nose, rolling her shoulders. You make it sound like I'm intruding. Now he turned, slow and deliberate. Aren't you? Ha-eun didn't flinch, but something about his gaze made her fingers tighten around the strap of her bag. There was nothing welcoming about this man. Nothing warm, nothing inviting. He had given her a room down the hall from his, made it clear they would lead separate lives, and even instructed the staff to treat her as a guest, not a wife. She wasn't expecting romance, but the coldness of it all made her stomach twist in ways she didn't like. Ji-ho took a step closer, his presence sharp like glass. "You don't belong here, Yoon Ha-eun." His voice was low, quiet, but somehow that only made it worse. Ha-eun forced herself to meet his gaze. And yet, here I am. Something flickered across his face. Annoyance, amusement, she couldn't tell, but then it was gone. Ji-ho exhaled sharply and turned away. "Dinner is at 7. Don't be late." The dismissal was clear, and yet, as he walked away, she swore she saw his shoulders tense, as if he wasn't as indifferent as he wanted to be. Their first meal together. The long dining table stretched between them like a battlefield. Ha-eun stared at the array of food before her, elegant, expensive, and completely uninviting. The dishes were plated with clinical precision, the cutlery polished to a mirror shine. Everything about the scene screamed formality, and she hated it. Ji-ho, on the other hand, ate with the same efficiency he did everything else. His posture was perfect, his movements precise. He didn't spare her a glance. The silence stretched. Ha-eun tapped her chopsticks against the edge of her plate, eyes narrowing slightly. "So this is what our marriage is going to be like. You ignoring me while we pretend we're not stuck in this together." Ji-ho didn't pause, didn't even look up. "You were the one who wanted this arrangement." "Correction. I wanted answers. You wanted your inheritance." She leaned forward slightly. "That doesn't mean we have to act like complete strangers." Ji-ho finally set his utensils down, his expression unreadable. "We are strangers." Ha-eun sighed, dropping her chopsticks onto her plate with a clink. "You're impossible." Ji-ho tilted his head slightly. "And you're naive if you think this is anything more than a contract." The words shouldn't have stung, but somehow they did. Ha-eun exhaled through her nose, pushing back her chair. "Enjoy your meal, Kang Ji-ho." As she left the dining room, she felt his eyes on her back. He didn't call her back, but he didn't look away either. A moment of unexpected proximity. It was past midnight when Ha-eun stepped into the kitchen, wrapped in an oversized sweater, her bare feet padding against the cold marble floor. She wasn't expecting anyone to be awake. Certainly not Ji-ho, leaning against the counter, sleeves rolled up, a tumbler of whiskey in his hand. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Ji-ho arched a brow. "Are you following me?" Ha-eun let out a quiet scoff, moving to the fridge. "Yes, because nothing sounds more thrilling than stalking my husband in his own home." Something about the word husband made Ji-ho's lips twitch, but he said nothing. Instead, he watched as she pulled out a carton of milk, pouring herself a glass. She caught his gaze and frowned. "What?" Ji-ho took a slow sip of his whiskey. "You're drinking milk." "And?" He shrugged, setting his glass down. "Didn't expect that." Ha-eun narrowed her eyes. "What exactly did you expect me to do at midnight? Sip 100-year-old scotch and contemplate capitalism?" Ji-ho smirked, a rare flicker of amusement crossing his face. "It would have been more fitting." Ha-eun rolled her eyes but couldn't stop the corner of her mouth from twitching. "You're unbelievable." Ji-ho studied her for a moment, as if trying to decide something. Then, without another word, he pushed off the counter and moved toward the door. But just as he passed her, his fingers brushed against her wrist. It was brief, barely a second, but the warmth of his skin sent a jolt up her arm. Ha-eun stilled. Ji-ho did too. Neither of them moved. Then, as if nothing had happened, Ji-ho pulled away. "Don't stay up too late." His voice was quieter now, less sharp, less controlled. And then he was gone, leaving Ha-eun standing there, glass of milk in hand, heartbeat unsteady. She told herself it meant nothing, but she wasn't sure she believed it. The days settled into a routine, though routine was a generous word for the fragile truce between Ji-ho and Ha-eun. They rarely spoke unless necessary, sharing the same space, but moving like strangers navigating an invisible line neither wanted to cross. Ji-ho worked late at the Kang Group headquarters, while Ha-eun spent her time in the guest room she had turned into a makeshift art studio. They were married on paper, but in every other way, they lived in separate worlds. But one thing was changing. Ji-ho noticed her now. He noticed the faint scent of paint lingering in the hallway after she passed. The way she tied her hair up absent-mindedly while sketching. The way she sighed softly whenever she was lost in thought. It irritated him, or at least, that's what he told himself. Tonight, as Ji-ho loosened his tie and stepped into the dimly lit penthouse, the first thing he saw was the faint glow coming from the room at the end of the hall. Ha-eun's door was slightly ajar, a sliver of warm light spilling into the otherwise dark corridor. He should have ignored it. Instead, he found himself pausing, listening. Inside, Ha-eun sat on the floor, surrounded by scattered papers and old letters, her brows furrowed in concentration. She didn't notice him. Ji-ho leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. Planning to redecorate? Ha-eun jumped, her hands instinctively moving to cover the letters. "You really have a habit of appearing out of nowhere," she muttered. Ji-ho arched a brow. "You left the door open." She huffed, gathering the papers into a neat pile. "You don't have to point it out." His gaze flickered to the stack in her lap. The paper was yellowed with age, the ink slightly faded. Something about it felt significant. "What is that?" Ha-eun hesitated. Then, with a quiet sigh, she placed the top letter on the floor between them. "Your grandfather's." Ji-ho stiffened. Slowly, he stepped inside, his polished shoes making no sound against the wooden floor. He knelt, eyes scanning the old-fashioned handwriting. Ha-eun spoke first. "I found them in the study this morning. They were tucked away in a hidden compartment in his desk." Ji-ho didn't respond. He was too focused on the words in front of him. "To the one I failed." The letter wasn't addressed to him, or even to anyone he recognized. A strange sensation settled in his chest. Something cold, something uncertain. Ha-eun studied his expression carefully. I think these letters are the key to why your grandfather chose me." Ji-ho finally looked up, meeting her gaze. There was no challenge in her eyes this time. No defiance. Just quiet understanding. And for the first time since this forced marriage began, Ji-ho realized something unsettling. He wasn't just trying to secure his inheritance anymore. He wanted to know the truth, even if it changed everything. Ji-ho read the words again. "To the one I failed." The ink had faded, but the weight of the sentence pressed down on him like a stone. His grandfather's handwriting was steady, deliberate, every stroke carrying a gravity Ji-ho had never associated with the man who had raised him. Silence filled the room. Ha-eun sat across from him, legs folded beneath her, watching him carefully. The soft glow of the desk lamp cast shadows across her face, making her expression unreadable. Ji-ho finally exhaled, setting the letter down. "Where did you find this?" Ha-eun hesitated before gesturing toward the old wooden desk pushed against the far wall. There was a hidden compartment inside the bottom drawer. I thought it was stuck at first, but then I noticed the latch. Ji-ho's gaze flickered to the desk. His grandfather's desk. How many times had he walked past it, never realizing it held secrets? Something about that irritated him. Without another word, he pushed himself up and strode toward it. Ha-eun followed as he knelt beside the drawer, running his fingers along the edges. Sure enough, there was a small indentation near the back, just big enough to fit a fingertip. A faint click sounded as the compartment released. Ji-ho pulled it open, revealing a small leather-bound journal inside. It was old, the cover worn, but the initials KDH were still visible in gold lettering. His grandfather's personal journal. Ji-ho's fingers hesitated over the worn edges. A strange, unfamiliar feeling settled in his chest, something like apprehension. He had spent his entire life believing Kang Ji-ho was a man of absolute control, unshakable, ruthless. But as he opened the journal and scanned the first page, he realized something. This was the writing of a man carrying regret. Ha-eun leaned closer. What does it say? Ji-ho swallowed, then began to read aloud. There are things I wish I could undo. Choices that brought fortune but cost something far greater. I have spent decades watching the consequences of my decisions unfold, and now, as my time nears its end, I must make one last attempt at redemption. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. Ji-ho turned the page, scanning the dates. The entries weren't from his grandfather's final days. They went back decades. And then he saw it. A name. Yoon Ha-eun. Ji-ho's head snapped up. Is this... Ha-eun's face had gone pale. My grandfather. A cold shiver ran down Ji-ho's spine. The connection between them, the one they had been forced into, wasn't random. It had been set in motion long before they were born. And now, neither of them could walk away from it. The silence in the room was suffocating. Ha-eun's hands trembled as she stared at the name written in ink. Yoon Ha-eun, her grandfather. A man she barely remembered but whose absence had shaped her entire life. Ji-ho felt his chest tighten. His grandfather had planned everything. Their marriage, their entanglement. It wasn't about inheritance. It was about atonement. Ji-ho exhaled, forcing himself to stay composed. What did your grandfather do? Ha-eun swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. He lost everything. My father told me once that my grandfather trusted the wrong person, that his business was taken from him, that we were never meant to be poor. Her eyes flickered with something raw. Betrayal, confusion, anger. Are you telling me that person was Kang Ji-ho? Ji-ho didn't answer, because he didn't know. All his life he had worshipped the legacy of his family, believed in it. Now, that foundation was cracking, revealing something rotten beneath the surface. Ha-eun's breath hitched. So, that's why I was chosen. This marriage... Her voice broke for a second, and when she spoke again, it was laced with something bitter. It was never about me. It was about fixing a mistake. Ji-ho felt something inside him snap. That's not true, he said before he could stop himself. Ha-eun let out a hollow laugh. Isn't it? She turned away, pressing a hand to her temple. Ji-ho had never seen her like this. Not composed, not confident, just shaken. A part of him hated it. Another part hated that he cared. He took a step toward her, hesitating before speaking again. Han... No. She turned sharply, her gaze locking onto his. For the first time, there was no defiance there, just pain. I can't do this. Ji-ho's chest tightened. What are you saying? I'm saying... She inhaled shakily. I want out. The words hit harder than he expected. She brushed past him, the scent of paint and lilacs lingering in the air. Ji-ho didn't move, didn't stop her, didn't say the words that clawed at the back of his throat. Instead, he just watched as she walked away. And for the first time, the thought of losing something actually terrified him. Ji-ho had never cared about losing people. His entire life had been built around power, control, and logic. Attachments were weaknesses. Love was an illusion. He had told himself that so many times that he almost believed it. But then Ha-eun left. And for the first time, Ji-ho realized how empty his world had always been. The penthouse felt colder without her presence, the silence heavier. He had thought her absence wouldn't matter, that her leaving would make things easier. It didn't. Ji-ho clenched his jaw as he stood in his office, staring out at the city. Seoul stretched beneath him, endless and unfeeling. It should have grounded him. Instead, it made him feel small. A quiet knock sounded at the door. Seo Min-kyu stepped inside, his expression unreadable. "She's gone." Ji-ho didn't respond. Min-kyu sighed, stepping closer. "I took care of the legal documents. If you sign them, the contract will be void." He set the papers on Ji-ho's desk. The weight of them felt heavier than it should. Ji-ho stared at them for a long moment. Then, slowly, he exhaled. "I'm not signing." Min-kyu's brows furrowed. "What?" Ji-ho looked at him, his expression unreadable. "I'm going to find her." Bukchon Hanok Village. Ha-eun's studio. Ha-eun stared at the blank canvas in front of her, brush poised but unmoving. It had been days since she left Ji-ho's world. She should have felt relieved, free from the weight of their forced marriage, free from the confusion that had tangled around her heart. But she didn't. Instead, she felt hollow. A soft chime echoed through the gallery as the door opened. Ha-eun glanced up, expecting a customer. Her breath caught. Ji-ho stood in the doorway, his usually perfect suit slightly disheveled, dark circles beneath his eyes. He looked different. Not like the arrogant heir who had walked into her life, but like a man who had lost something he never realized he needed. Neither of them spoke at first. Then Ji-ho stepped forward. "I'm not here because of the contract." Ha-eun's fingers tightened around the brush. "Then why are you here?" Ji-ho's jaw tensed. He had spent his entire life avoiding this moment. But now, standing in front of her, he couldn't run from it anymore. "Because losing you hurts more than I thought it would." The brush slipped from Ha-eun's fingers, landing with a soft thud on the floor. Ji-ho took another step forward, his voice quieter now. "I don't care about the contract, the inheritance, or what my grandfather wanted. I don't care about anything except..." He exhaled sharply. "Except you." Ha-eun's heart pounded painfully against her ribs. Ji-ho had always been cold, distant, untouchable. But right now, he was just a man standing in front of her, waiting for her to decide if she would let him in. Tears burned at the edges of her eyes. "Do you even know what love is, Kang Ji-ho?" Ji-ho's lips twitched, something soft passing through his gaze. "No," he admitted, "but I'm willing to learn." For the first time, Ha-eun didn't step away. And for the first time, Ji-ho let himself hope. The air between them felt different now. Ji-ho had spent his life believing love was nothing more than a transaction, a contract to be negotiated, a weakness to be avoided. But standing here, looking at Ha-eun, he knew he had been wrong. Ha-eun swallowed hard, searching his face for hesitation, for the cold detachment that had once defined him. It wasn't there. Instead, there was something else. Uncertainty, hope, maybe even fear. She exhaled softly. "And what if I don't want to be your lesson?" Ji-ho's lips twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. "Then I'll have to convince you otherwise." A beat of silence passed. Then, Ha-eun did something she never thought she would. She stepped closer. Ji-ho's breath hitched, just barely, and that tiny hesitation, the way this arrogant, untouchable man suddenly seemed nervous, made something inside her ache. "You're impossible," she muttered. Ji-ho tilted his head slightly. "And yet you're still here." She hated that he was right, or maybe she didn't. 3 months later, the spring breeze was warm, carrying the scent of blooming flowers through the narrow streets of Bukchon Hanok Village. The world felt lighter these days, softer. Ha-eun sat on the steps of her gallery, the familiar weight of a sketchbook in her lap. She had spent so long running from this story, from the reasons behind their marriage, from Ji-ho himself. But now she realized something. She wasn't running anymore. A shadow fell over her page. She looked up, and there he was. Ji-ho, dressed casually for once, sleeves rolled up, tie undone, hair slightly tousled. He still carried the sharp edges of the man she had first met, but there was something different now, something warmer. He held out a small paper bag. "You forgot to eat lunch." Ha-eun arched a brow. "Since when do you care about things like that?" Ji-ho exhaled through his nose, setting the bag beside her. "Since I realized you get cranky when you're hungry." She laughed, shaking her head. "You're learning." Ji-ho smirked, settling beside her. For once, there were no contracts between them, no expectations, no conditions. Just them. Ha-eun glanced at him, voice quieter now. "Are you happy, Ji-ho?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Then, finally, he spoke. "I think I'm finally learning what that means." And for the first time, Ha-eun let herself believe in their happy ending,